So thank you very much for the wonderful introduction. And like I said, please feel free to ask questions and I will try to get to them either through the presentation or afterwards. I know we already had a land acknowledgement, but I do want to acknowledge that I am a seventh generation settler of Irish, Scottish, and English descent. And my ancestors had the privilege to live and settle on the land off the waters of the now extinct Beothunk people, which are the true people on the coastlines of Newfoundland and Labrador. And for the past three generations, we've lived and raised our family in the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I like to really recognize that I realize I have a responsibility towards reconciliation and undoing of ongoing colonial practices, particularly with my stripe as I really look at how can I work to help address any inequities in the healthcare system through my role at Pacific Blue Cross. Now, you did a wonderful job of the introduction. This is all of my stuff of who I am, but I do like to point out I'm more than that. I'm a white woman. I'm cisgender. I'm a person with disabilities. I had the privilege to be university educated, and I'm nearing retirement. I'm the youngest of five children. And I bring that out because the intersectionality of who we are comes into every conversation. It's the lived experiences we have. And so I do encourage you all to bring your lived experiences into today's conversation. I also do want to point out that I'm not a lawyer. And so if there are any legal type questions, I can give you my guidance as somebody who's had them asked, but I might have to refer you elsewhere in those sorts of realms because law is not where my background is. I also just want to remember that I am here because Pacific Blue Cross is letting me take time out of my busy day today. And I'm sure if you guys are in healthcare, you've heard of us. And one of the things that I'm very privileged with is that Pacific Blue Cross really does look for how do we address health inequity in the province for British Columbians. And it's one of the things we do take very seriously. And I'm very fortunate to work for a company, particularly in these trying times, that is still staying rooted in valuing diversity, inequity, and to try to make sure all people are included. So I'm going to jump into today's topic on bullying and harassment. And I'm going to start with a video. And I know coming from healthcare, you may be looking at this because this is a non-healthcare video, but I want you to look at it through the eyes of the feelings and the emotions that are experienced by people who are experiencing bullying and harassment. So we're going to watch a short video.
Morning.
Where are you going?
I'm picking up the propane heaters. Is it left or right?
What, do I look like dispatch?
Don't they tell you guys anything?
Yeah, they gave me the location.
And you're here.
I think it truly often starts as innocent teasing.
Guys, seriously, is it left or right?
Oh, look at that. It's break time.
It gets bigger and the comments get harsher and it gets more personal. And at some point, the line is crossed.
They call you an idiot, they call you stupid, kind of get bumped around like you're not the person on the crew that anybody wants, and everybody jokes about it, and it kind of gets to a point where now you're getting bullied and harassed by the whole crew.
It's just a nightmare because it's not that they don't want you there, is that they want to have some fun at your expense. They want you to sweat. They want to see you make mistakes. They want to see all of that stuff happen, and it's for their entertainment.
What's said escalates each time, and each worker tries to outdo what the last guy said to whoever the target is. And pretty soon the crew are doing things and saying things that they would never dream of doing or saying, in a normal setting.
It's a toxic environment to be in if there's bullying and harassment going on all the time.
It poisons everything. It affects everyone. It's not just the construction site. It's you're going to take it home and now it's you're driving in traffic and you might get in a traffic accident because you're distracted, or you're going home and you yell at your kids and then your kids think you don't love them. And it's just that ripple effect where it absolutely affects everyone when bullying and harassment happens. It's not insular, and it's not just the people involved. It is literally that ripple effect where it affects everything.
You know, I can remember days where I didn't really want to pick up the phone and call to see if I was working because I really didn't want to go in. But the pile of bills on the end table said I had to pick up the phone.
I really wonder how many really good employees I've lost because of bullying. I'll never know.
You feel lonely. You feel depressed. You feel extreme states of sadness. You feel confused. You feel angry. You feel completely emotional.
I used to go off in the bathroom and lock myself in and cry because I was so angry that I was either going to hit somebody or I'd cry. And I wasn't about to hit people, so I would just go off in a corner and cry. And then wash my face and go right back to work because I needed to provide for my son.
There's nothing worse than walking in a room and everybody's giving you a bad time. There's no positive feelings that arise out of that. If you don't feel like you belong there, you start to believe what they're telling you.
You may not like the people that you work with, but you have to maintain a certain type of professionalism.
I teach the girls to look at these guys and say, would you like it if somebody said that to your daughter? Would you like it if somebody said that to your wife? And it tends to change the guy's perspective because all of a sudden there's this young woman who's standing in front of them and say, wait a minute, that's not okay with me. Stop it. And would you say that? Would you like your wife to know that that's what you're saying to a young woman?
It's harassment, really, because, you know, the next person beside them, they'll treat completely different because of the gender, right?
Bring it in.
When I was a young foreman, we had a really good young apprentice on our crew. No matter what he did, he was picked on for it. He was nitpicked on the crew. Nothing was ever good enough.
We good? Yeah, sure.
I found myself saying stuff to the young apprentice that was said to me when I was a young apprentice. And it was when I heard myself saying that stuff when I realized that the culture had to change in our crew.
Why would you put a wall here? Can you not see the lines?
I think I wasted a lot of energy on being the wrong type of leader.
Who wants to go beyond the call of duty for someone that screams and rants and raves at you all day long? Who says that you don't know what you're doing and you don't have the skill set and you're a loser? How does that motivate you to work hard and to be committed? It doesn't.
Was it bullying to me? No, I don't think I thought about it that way. But when you think of how much you really yell and drive guys, there is bullying in there.
The supervisor can't be the problem. If the supervisor and our supervision remain to be the problem, then nothing's going to change.
If you stand by, you're saying that it's acceptable for what's happening. And to me, if you're saying it's acceptable for that to happen, then you're just as culpable for what's happening as the person who's doing it.
It's about being professional, having a professionalism in your workplace. We want to teach people now. We want to make sure everybody's working safely, everybody's comfortable in what they're doing.
We want zero accidents. And if bullying or being harassed is getting into somebody's head, they're going to make mistakes sooner or later. And that's something we don't want.
Our jobs are dangerous enough. You cannot bring that extra level of distrust into a job. You cannot.
Bullying is something that has to stop. Every smart CEO knows that. Every smart CEO has to ensure that it doesn't happen in their company, and they have to lead by example.
I've had, people say to me before, if we can't bully and harass people on the job site, all that's going to be left to do is put buildings up.
So I always like to start with that video because I do think it's important for us to realize that, sorry, I do think it's important for us to realize the personal impact that bullying and harassment has. And you can be in any industry, and it doesn't change the feelings that are created from bullying and harassment. These are some statistics from a recent report from the HR Reporter, which is stating that 7 out of every 10, or 71%, of Canadian employees are saying that they are being bullying and harassed at the work, or have been bullying and harassed in the workplace. And so Canadian employers need to do a better job on how to address it. And so you can see here that 71% say they have experienced it in their careers, but you can also see here that 65%, nearly 2/3, have experienced at least one behavior of bullying and harassment in the past 2 years. 43% of those were sexual harassment and violence. And then 26% of the population has said they've experienced some type of work-related online harassment. And so when you think of those statistics, 2/3 of the population have experienced that within this year. I think I saw we had about 100 people on the call, which means about 65% of you attending today have likely experienced some sort of workplace harassment or violence in the past 2 years. When you look at it from different types of jobs, you can see here's a number of industries, and it's showing both the online sexual and harassment and the overall bullying and harassment and violence experienced. You can see one of the highest categories there is the healthcare and social assistance workers. I've been employed in almost all of these careers. I'm in healthcare right now. I've worked in public as an optician selling glasses. So I've taken money, I've interacted with the public, and I've worked in restaurants in my career. And at first, when I saw this statistic, I was really surprised that healthcare and social assistance workers were so high. I would have thought, personally, I would have thought it would have been the alcohol, those who served, or just dealing with the general public. And it's funny, when the report came out, I started talking to some of our frontline people, which are the folks in our industry that are on the phones, and their feedback on it, as being professionals in this industry, is that a lot of times we're dealing with people who are under excessive stress when we're dealing with the public. Is that a lot of times in healthcare work, you're dealing with people during some of their hardest times, which kind of ramps up the opportunities or the emotions that can lead to bullying and harassment. In healthcare, I mentioned it's long tolerated or ignored bullying behaviors. And I think there's a number of reasons for it. They're listing some factors here. So it's things like lack of resources for fatigue management. I think a lot of people in the healthcare industry are working long hours, and they're working under very stressful conditions. Mental illness and substance abuse, a lot of times with the people that they're dealing with, can also lead to an increased factor. Heavy workloads can lead to an increased factor. Personal issues, as well as unrealistic self images. So a lot of these things can really impact the likelihood of bullying and harassment. And I think when I look at it, I think my son actually studied to become a doctor. And while he was studying to become a doctor, what became very prevalent to him was, in the healthcare industry, A, the lack of sleep, but two, there was a culture of treating people poorly within the work environment. At least that was his personal experience, is the one I can speak from. And I remember him being surprised because a doctor had treated him like a person. And that shouldn't be something that really comes as a surprise. So I think it's been one of those things that in some aspects of healthcare has been tolerated and has been ignored. Let's go to the next slide. A lot of people do report bullying and harassment, and more than half of the people who report it, whether it's to their union, whether it's to a supervisor or manager, or whether they've gone through a formal route, said it made no difference at all. So there's this environment created, and this isn't specific to healthcare, but this environment created where half the time when it's reported, people are saying it made no difference at all. There's also the aspect, the same trend was seen with sexual harassment and violence. So you're seeing very similar statistics there saying that it made no difference. But where it gets a little bit scarier is that 1/4 of the people who reported it said that reporting it actually made it worse, made the situation worse. And so again, not really great statistics showing up there. And then when it comes to speaking up itself, people often feel when they're hesitant to speak up because they're afraid it's going to make uncomfortable situations at work. And I can relate to that. I've been in situations in the workplace where someone has said or done something that made me feel uncomfortable. And I'm afraid to bring it up, to ramp it up, thinking maybe I just need to ignore it. Maybe this won't happen again, because you don't want to create those ripples. It can also be one of the top reasons people don't is the safety concerns that they have or fear of backlash. And overall, statistically, 33% of people report that fear of retaliation from the perpetrator is the thing that's going to impact it. So there's a multitude of reasons why people are reluctant to speak up. There's that stigma, which is 28% just have this fear. 24% don't believe any action is going to be taken because they've seen it in the past. Nothing's ever been done, so they're not going to report it again. There's a concern that reporting it will affect their career advancement. And I know, I mean, I'm older than probably a lot of you on the phone, but I grew up in an era where it was okay in business to treat women less than. And I didn't speak up. I kind of went along to go along with the boys because I was afraid it would really impact my ability to move forward within my organization. There's also fear of termination, that people are afraid that if they speak up, that they may lose their job. And I think that fear is higher on people who don't know their rights. And so again, it's one of those things that education in this area helps people, particularly people who may be newer to Canada and may not know how some of our laws work. There's also an uncertainty of who do I report it to if bullying and harassment is going on, if I'm feeling that this is a toxic environment and I don't know who to report it to, where do I go? And then finally, just an additional finding here is it's interesting that 60% of employees who were surveyed said they would feel much more comfortable dealing with the problem, intervening, reporting it, if they had some training and understood what to do and where to go. So I'm going to show you a video that is from WorkSafe, which really just spells out what is bullying and harassment.
It seems like everyone is talking about bullying and harassment. But what does it mean for you and your workplace? This video explains what workplace bullying and harassment is and what it's not. Legal obligations for employers, supervisors, and workers. And where to get the information you need. So first off, what is workplace bullying and harassment? It includes any inappropriate conduct or comment by a person towards a worker that the person knew or reasonably ought to have known would cause that worker to be humiliated or intimidated. Examples could be yelling or name-calling, vandalizing personal belongings, harmful hazing or initiation practices. There might be a single perpetrator or a group. There may be just one target or many. Bullying and harassment can occur between co-workers or between the employer and a worker. Or it can come from external sources, such as members of the public, clients, and customers, or workers from other organizations. Bullying and harassment also extends to online activities. Cyberbullying can occur through email, text messages, social networks, and other websites. What is not considered workplace bullying and harassment? Managers and supervisors have many responsibilities. Decisions relating to job duties, workloads, deadlines, and performance management, or the direction of workers and the workplace are not bullying and harassment. So what are your legal duties? Employers have an obligation to take reasonable steps to prevent bullying and harassment, or minimize it where possible. Employers must also develop a policy statement that addresses bullying and harassment in the workplace. Develop and implement procedures for reporting incidents or complaints, and for how they will be dealt with. They also have to train supervisors and workers. Supervisors and workers are required to comply with the employer's policies and procedures and not engage in workplace bullying and harassment. Workers must report it when they see it or experience it. The bottom line is, bullying and harassment is a workplace hazard that poses a risk to the health and safety of workers. As part of their responsibility to protect worker safety, WorkSafe BC prevention officers will inspect workplaces to determine if employers have taken reasonable steps to prevent and address bullying and harassment. The occupational health and safety policies explain what WorkSafe BC considers to be reasonable steps for employers to take. When bullying is reported, it gives employers an opportunity to take positive action. Put an end to workplace bullying and harassment. An online toolkit is available that includes helpful information and advice. For the resources you need, visit worksafebc.com/bullying.
So one of the ways BC is different than other provinces is this is covered by WorkSafe. So what that means is that this is part of health and safety within the workplace in British Columbia. And it's something that all employers are required and bound by. So I want to go over a couple of really key points in what the video that you just saw covers. So the first piece is really the definition of bullying and harassment. And it's any inappropriate conduct or comment by a person towards a worker that the person knew or ought to have known would cause the worker to be humiliated and intimidated. So that knew or ought to have been known is important. It really falls under the reasonable person's guidelines. And so when they're doing something like that, they're looking at whether a reasonable person should have known that that would cause somebody to be humiliated and intimidated. So that's the actual definition of bullying and harassment. And it can take a lot of different forms. It can be things like verbal aggression or name calling. It can be things like rudeness and disrespect. And I think most of us, when it's overt like that, you can be more used to it. You can see it. It's easy to recognize. But it can also be things that are more subtle. It can be gossiping or spreading malicious rumors that aren't true. It could be excluding someone from workplace activities. So for example, in my workplace, we had 3 coworkers who would call over the cubicles about who wanted to order from lunch, but just for 3 of them. And we had to talk to it about, either offer it to everybody or be more discreet. You can't exclude people like that from workplace activities. It can be more aggressive, like personal attacks or disrespect. It could be criticizing somebody in public or somebody misusing the power they have. It could be something that intimidates or humiliates somebody, and practical jokes or hazing. And one that we're seeing a lot coming up and being reported more is misgendering, using someone's improper pronouns, or using an employee's dead names if they've gone through gender affirming care. I also want to point out, does intent matter? And this goes back to that reasonable persons clause. Intent does not determine whether bullying and harassment existed. A person cannot excuse his or her behavior by saying they did not intend for their behaviors to be humiliating or intimidating. What determines that, again, goes to that reasonable person clause. Would somebody know or should ought to have known? So even though someone did a behavior that maybe they didn't intend to cause harm, if it did, it would be looked at. Would a reasonable person have felt that to be discriminating, humiliating, or intimidating? So they do look at that. Now, obviously, if someone didn't intend it and it was kind of subtle, the punishments can vary. You know, something that's much more violent or much more overt is going to have harsher repercussions than if somebody said something unintentionally that hurt someone's feelings. Sometimes it can just be apology that's required, because I go through life believing that nobody does things to intentionally hurt me, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. And so sometimes these can be fixed with a heartfelt apology, but sometimes it's bigger than that, and it needs to bubble up through sort of human resources or through WorkSafe for it to be addressed. Again, bullying and harassment can be a one-time event. So an example here is a woman being fired because her manager found out that she was pregnant. So something very overt, a one-time event. It can be creating a poisoned workplace. So it can be a bunch of words and actions that keep on building until it becomes what feels toxic to an employee. So it could be a coworker's repeatedly making race-based comments or jokes about a minority worker, and it gets to the point where they've taken it and said, this isn't appropriate, I can't work here anymore. It can be something that's very obvious, like a worker using a wheelchair who loses their job when a company relocates, or it can be something that's much more subtle. So for example, a manager limits opportunities to a group of workers, in this case, younger workers, by assigning important projects to older workers or tenured workers. So it can be something that's more subtle, or it can be something that's obvious. So what is not bullying and harassment? Addressing performance or conduct isn't considered bullying and harassment. Job duties, assigning job duties, work instruction, supervision, feedback, workloads and deadloads, work evaluations, disciplinary things, suspensions, terminations, or layoffs, transfers, promotions, and reorganizations. So those are not considered bullying and harassment with the umbrella. However, I can say that they can sometimes bleed into bullying and harassment. So if an employer or manager, for example, is assigning an unpleasant job duty to a particular individual in a method to punish them or humiliate them, even though it falls under the job duties category, there's a bigger overarching piece on bullying and harassment there. So while these are saying it's not bullying and harassment, it can sometimes bleed over into the other category. So there are responsibilities. So I think a lot of times employees don't think they have any responsibilities when it comes to bullying and harassment. And you do. Every worker has to take reasonable steps to protect not only their own health and safety, but the health and safety of those around them. So the responsibility of an employee is you can't engage in bullying and harassment of others. You need to report it if you've experienced it or if you observe it. And you need to apply and comply your policies and procedures as they apply to bullying and harassment. So again, you have to realize, I don't know if any of you have ever been pulled in as a witness on a bullying and harassment investigation. But as a witness, if you've observed it and not reported it, you are going to then be interrogated and asked why you didn't report it, because it is part of your responsibility under the WorkSafe guidelines. The employer also has responsibilities, and so they need to make sure that people are working in a healthy and safe environment and that they're creating that. And there needs to be a policy to prevent and address bullying harassment. So if you're working for an employer and haven't seen it, you should be able to go down to your HR and ask to see it, or you should be able to talk to your union, or it should be posted somewhere where you've got access to it. They also need to take steps to minimize it and prevent it. So they do have a duty to act if somebody reports it to them. So does the union, that there needs to be steps in place when reporting it to look into it from that point. They need to put reporting procedures in place, and they need to track how to deal with incidents and complaints. They need to inform workers of the policy statement, and this is usually done by the Health and Safety Committee, is the policy statement. So again, you can also reach out to your Health and Safety Committee. They may have information. And then they are required to train supervisors and workers on how to recognize, respond, and report incidents and complaints of bullying and harassment. I know my organization, it's part of the onboarding, is that we train all employees and we track that they have completed it. But also once a year, we run a campaign where we do posters and we remind people of the policy and how to report bullying and harassment. So you want to look into what your employer does. And then that policy needs to be reviewed annually. And this is typically done, again, by the Health and Safety Committee at your employment. So I'm going to show you a video now on how you can address workplace bullying and harassment with a coworker. Now, you don't need to go to a coworker first. That I do recognize that it can be uncomfortable trying to deal with something directly with an individual, but it's usually your best first case, particularly if the bullying and harassment it isn't kind of crossing the line. It's not that overt violent or harassment. It's much more subtle. Usually talking in the individual is the first place to start. So I'll show you a video from WorkSafe on that.
As a worker, you're entitled to protection from bullying and harassment. That's why every employer in British Columbia must have policies and procedures to prevent and address it. Here's an example of how you might talk to someone who is bullying and harassing you at work.
Hi, Cindy. Could we talk when you've got a minute? Sure, I'm free now. On Monday, you said my report was fine. Then today, at our team meeting, you said I must have been drunk when I wrote it. You've said things like that before.
When I looked at it again today, I thought your report was garbage, so I said so.
Cindy, when you insult me in front of our team, it's humiliating. I'd prefer if you would talk to me privately. If you provide suggestions instead of criticizing me, I could fix it.
I don't understand why you're bringing this up. No one else has a problem with how I speak.
Maybe it's not your intention, but it's degrading and it needs to stop.
All workers have a duty not to engage in bullying and harassment. If you witness or experience it, you must report it. For more information and resources, go to worksafebc.com/bullying.
So in that situation, it was somebody addressing
As a worker, you're entitled to protect.
In that particular case, it was an employee going and actually addressing it with the other employee. And I know that this isn't always going to happen, but I know that I have tried this in the past and I have had more success than I've had failure, but it's not within everyone's comfort zone. And I do recognize that. There are other routes to go, and we'll talk about some of those other routes. But first, I just want to bring up the BC Human Rights Code, because some bullying and harassment behaviors may also breach into the BC Human Rights Code. Now, the code is defined as unwelcome conduct based on prohibited grounds of discrimination that is reasonably known to be unwelcome and detrimentally affects the work environment or involves threats or promises that are job related. And this is discriminating against any of the protected classes. So things like, or protected identities. So things like Indigenous identity, race, color, ancestry, place of origin, political belief, religion, marital status, family status, physical or mental disability, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or a criminal offense that's unrelated to the crime. So if the bullying and harassment, particularly coming from an employer, falls into any of those categories, they may be violating the bullying and harassment codes from WorkSafe, but it could also cross into a BC human rights violation code. So I do like to call that out because it is another venue you can go to. So the next one I'm going to look at is, what do you do if it's your boss doing the bullying? So let's do a quick video on this.
Every employer in British Columbia must have procedures for workers to report workplace bullying and harassment. This includes what to do if the employer or supervisor is the alleged bully. Here's an example of a situation where the employer is the alleged bully.
Hey, son. What's up?
There's some stuff going on at work, and I don't know what to do.
Well, what's going on?
My boss keeps wrecking my stuff. Look what he drew on my backpack, and he's always insulting me and calling me names.
Are you kidding?
Did you tell him to stop?
Of course, but he just laughed and told me to lighten up.
I'm going down there to have a word with him.
No, Dad. This is my problem.
There must be something else you can do. Is there anyone else you can report this to?
Not really. He owns the company, and the other workers are his buddies.
So, what are you supposed to do if your boss is the bully?
Every employer in British Columbia must have procedures for workers to report workplace bullying and harassment. This includes what to do if the employer or supervisor is the alleged bully. For more information and advice, contact WorkSafe BC's Prevention Information Line or visit worksafebc.com/bullying.
Is always a tough one. Because it does happen, and I was looking in the chats and people saying, why do I think that so many people doesn't get handled or don't report it? I think because a lot of times it can become a he said, she said, and that a lot of times in these situations, one person will say one thing and another person will say, well, that's not how it happened. And so there's a number of things that you can do. The first thing, well, in this case, it's not going to help because it was the owner, but you can always, if it is your manager, you can go one level up. So most organizations have an open door policy where you can go higher up in the organization. You can go directly to human resources or labor relations. You can go directly to a union, but you can also bypass that and you can go to WorkSafe BC. And so there are other venues. And I think a lot of times when people say nothing happened, conversations that take place can be private, particularly in an HR perspective. So let's take a look at an employer dealing with it. And we can talk about how sometimes this can be a challenge.
Employers must have procedures in place to deal with workplace bullying and harassment. If an incident or complaint occurs, an investigation must be conducted promptly. Here's an example of how to talk to an employee who has been investigated for bullying and harassment.
Chef, as you know, we received a complaint from Janet about your behavior in the kitchen.
Well, she's got to toughen up. We work in a restaurant. It's a high-pressure place.
I get it. The kitchen can be a stressful place to work, but we don't tolerate abusive behavior. We investigated the complaint and determined that your intimidating behavior and verbal abuse were bullying and harassment. Janet has asked for an apology.
Really? You want me to apologize to one of the cooks?
Yes, and it's important you understand that your negative behavior affects everyone, not just Janet. A copy of the investigation has been put in your personnel file. Now let's sit down and review the company policy on bullying and harassment and make sure this doesn't happen again.
If an incident or complaint occurs, Investigations should be fair and impartial, be focused on finding facts and evidence. For more information on how to conduct investigations, go to worksafebc.com/bullying.
So I do like to bring this up a bit in terms of what happens when someone investigates, because I've been on the other side of being involved in conducting these types of investigations. And I'm going to tell you, it really varies. And if you look at this particular case, the manager has gone and has spoken to the individual, told them their behavior isn't acceptable, told them that notification will be going in their file, that it needs to stop. But if you think of Janet, who raised the complaint, Janet isn't going to get any information about the investigation. Employers can't talk about another employee's. Like, I'm sure Janet would love to have the manager go back to her and say, I've spoken to him. We put a disciplinary action in his personnel file. He's been told not to do it again. But employers get put in the situation where they can't share disciplinary action that's taken place with one employee with the other. All they can basically say is it's been addressed. I can also say that a lot of things will vary in terms of what happens with an individual. You know, the more heinous, I guess you could say, the bullying is, chances are it could lead up to and including immediate termination. But things can vary in terms of, you know, if you have an employee that does something pretty bad in their first 90 days, chances are they'll lose their job. Whereas if an employee has been with a company for 15 years with no record of ever having done anything, chances are they'll be given some sort of warning. So a lot of things come into play with how an employer will deal with this. It will be based off of, you know, how harmful the behavior was, the employee's tenure, and the employee's past experiences. How have they done this in the past? And the more reoccurring something is, the more likely it's going to be ramping it up. So let's look at the next one. So what to do, and this is probably the big one here. The first thing is document it. The more you can, if you feel you're being bullied and harassed, or if you witness bullying and harassment, you got to put pen to paper. Yes, you could type it, but my recommendation is always pen to paper, and make a note of who was there, who was involved, who saw it, who was the witness, and then write down exactly what happened with the date. And even if you're not going to complain about it right now, if something made you uncomfortable, document it, because if it happens again, you're going to want to pull out that past documentation. Ideally, you can speak to the individual. And I know not everybody's going to be comfortable with that. But again, I'm a true believer that most people don't do and say things to intentionally hurt people. Yes, there are some that do, but I don't think that's the majority. And I know if I ever did or said something that hurt somebody, I would prefer for them to come up to me and make me aware of it so I could change my behavior. So if you are comfortable, try to speak to the individual. If your organization has somebody to help you coaching that conversation, I frequently have people reach out to me, for example, to say, I need to have this difficult conversation with a coworker. Can you help me prepare for it? Review your workplace bullying and harassment policies, speak to your supervisor, speak to a union rep. You can contact WorkSafe directly. They also have a phone line you can use, and that you can go in and phone them and get guidance on how to deal with situations. And then the final thing is to just submit a bullying and harassment questionnaire, which is located on WorkSafe's site. You can go through it. We'll ask you to answer a bunch of questions, and that'll really help to guide you in terms of what are some of your next steps. So that is really it for my presentation, with a beautiful spring shot of Vancouver, which I hope to see in person as opposed to our gloomy days. But I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And I know we've got some information here, and I'll be open for any particular questions. Let me see if I can. Did you have a chance to go through these at all and see any you want me to call out?
There's a couple or there's 3 now in the question and answer just at the bottom there. You can open them.
Oh, okay. Let me look at, I'll start in there. What are bullying and harassment's resolutions practices done with investigations and without investigations? Resolution practices are going to depend on the resources of the organization to a degree. I work in an organization where we're fortunate that we can bring in mediators for resolutions. We can hire independent consultants. We will partner with the union, and we will pick out an independent investigation to take place. When it's without an investigation, it's usually just done by a conversation with the individuals, sometimes with either HR or HR with the union, depending on the situation, or it can be dealt with just with the employee. So there's a number of different ways, and it's going to depend. It's going to depend on the situation. The next question is, how do I hold non-workers like residents accountable? And if you're talking there about the public, that's going to have some depending on your organization and your policies. I know quite often in our workplace, we can have members who phone and can be harassing one of our people on the phone. And when that occurs, their first step is to bump it up to a manager. But we also tell our people phoning in, and this is our company policy, that we don't tolerate this type of behavior, and that, if they want to continue with this conversation, it's going to need to change. And in one rare case, I remember working with the call center, they were actually told they were no longer allowed to call in, and there was a note put in, and they would have to deal directly with their employer. So I'm not sure if that helps, but again, I believe nobody is required to take bullying and harassment. And even if it's with the public, you need to find out what your employer's stance is on what you can and can't do. We've got a number of questions that says, we often have people who, once a situation is investigated, say, I don't want an apology or to talk to them again. How appropriate is this request? It's going to depend on the level of harassment as well as the resolution. I would like to think if it came from the heart, that people could accept an apology. I think the reality is, in the workplace, we are required to treat everyone with dignity and respect. And when someone's been disrespectful to us, it doesn't then give us the ability to be disrespectful to them. But I do know in situations where they have created some separation, but that's usually dependent on the employer. You see, there's another question in here. Cyberbullying seems to be on the rise. How is it handled now? I don't know if staff, and it's asking if staff understand their responsibility to report it on social media. I don't know if people realize that it still falls under workplace bullying and harassment, even though it's done in a cyberspace and on social media outside, but it does. And so I've been involved in situations where an employee has taken screenshots of things that were posted about them by a coworker on a different site, not on a company site, and brought it into the workplace, and it launched a full investigation of bullying and harassment because it does cross into it, and it is covered. Trying to see if there's there's more questions. What if you have been bullied for so long, you begin to fight for yourself, and now the employers are claiming you're the one in the wrong? I would go directly to WorkSafe. Sometimes if something's not being addressed, I would get in, I would say you want somebody else up against it, somebody else involved, that you don't think it's being done impartial. And you can bypass your employers completely going to WorkSafe. You can also go to WorkSafe if you don't feel that a resolution has occurred. And WorkSafe, I know, They'll usually suggest you get an auditor to come in as someone independent to investigate. But I know if the company or the individual has had multiple complaints, WorkSafe will come in themselves and do an investigation, and they will investigate other departments as well within the organization. And so it's just like any other WorkSafe violation. What is the equivalent to WorkSafe in other provinces? I don't have a clue. I apologize. I'm not familiar with that. I can only speak on BC and some of our allegations in here. When your allegations are against the supervisors or the union, again, if you can't go to one or the other, I would look to go to WorkSafe directly. And somebody's answered a question about other provinces being WSIB in Ontario. So let me look in the other questions things, because there's a bunch coming in here, and I'll see how many I can get answered. We've got, I think, a few more minutes left, although I'm not showing the time on my clock here. But I'll go through as many as I can. What if HR is the person being bullied and senior leadership is not acknowledging it's being reported? Again, I would go to WorkSafe. When you've reported it, you've done your diligence, and then you can report it. Does favoritism count as bullying? Yes, it can. It can, if you're showing preference, particularly in the workforce, to individuals and maybe giving them preferred assignments or giving them preferred shifts without any validation in terms of performance. So again, that's kind of a fine line. So for example, if you have a high performer and you're giving them busier shifts, that's not necessarily deemed as favoritism. But if it's just somebody you like and it's not based off of a difference in their abilities, then yes, that can be seen as giving someone preferential treatment, which can then be seen as bullying. Let me see if there's other questions. Sorry, every time I scroll up, someone types in a question and it goes back. Bullying harassment creates a toxic work environment that can lead to suicides, mental health issues, heart attacks. Yeah, that's really true. And that's actually why in our province it's covered by WorkSafe, because it does create a dangerous work environment. And it can lead to a lot of other issues that can impact all sorts of aspects of your life. So a really good point in there. What if an employee is being bullied and doesn't want their name mentioned, afraid of retaliation? Yeah, unfortunately, usually they will need to bring a name involved in order for bullying and harassment, because they need to be able to conduct an investigation. And unless it's something that's happening to a larger group of people, usually you do have to have some sort of involvement. I've got a thing, Human Rights Tribunal, if we aren't WorkSafe. I think what the question is, when does it become a human rights tribunal? Sometimes if bullying and harassment goes into the human rights, you can file under both, and you can file under human rights code, and you can file under WorkSafe. So there are multiple ways you can done it. I've only seen it in my career doing this once in 25 years. And in that case, it turned out to be neither. But yeah, you can go that route. Trying to think if there's other questions here as I'm scanning through. So every time I start scanning up, it goes back down when somebody types something. I think most of the rest are asking for questions. So I think if I'm not seeing any additional questions, so I'll hand it over to the moderator.
Yeah, someone asked if the employee is being bullied and doesn't want their name mentioned or afraid of retaliation.
Yeah, it's usually pretty difficult for them not to mention somebody's name. The only way a name isn't usually mentioned if when a group of people who are lodging the same complaint. But usually you do have the ability, you do have to have the ability of a formal complaint. So it makes it more challenging when someone's not willing to put their name behind it. It's also challenging from a manager's perspective. Like if somebody comes into me and I'm a manager and says, you know, so and so is bullying, harassing me, but don't say anything, I just want to vent. I now have a duty to act. So anytime you, either as an employer, a manager, or an employee is made aware of bullying and harassment, under the code, you do have a duty to react and to report it, even when somebody tells you they'd rather you don't. It's like if somebody said so-and-so stealing money, but don't say anything about it. You know, you do have a duty to act in those cases.